Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Ukraine Crisis Media Center starts its work, and the first event for today is weekly updates from the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission. I give the floor to Mr. Alexander Hook, Principal Deputy Chief Monitor of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine.
Good morning, dear friends. Last week, the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine noted a 25% increase in the number of ceasefire violations. We actually recorded 2,469 ceasefire violations all along the contact line. Our observations demonstrate two things. Firstly, the ceasefire is not being adhered to. The sides claim they are adhering to the ceasefire, but 2,469 recorded ceasefire violations last week tell a different story. At least 2,469 times that mortars, artillery, assault rifles or heavy machine guns were fired. In just 1 week, 2,469 times that the sides did not adhere to the Minsk agreements. 2,469 times that the sides broke their promise to cease fire. 2,469 times that the men, women and children of eastern Ukraine were put at risk. They were put at risk because many of those ceasefire violations happened in or around residential areas. We confirmed that one man was injured in the Dubrovsky area of so-called DPR-controlled Donetsk city's Petrovsky district. That brings the total number of SMM-confirmed civilian casualties this year up to 388, 68 killed and 320 injured. Our casualty figures for the month of August showed an increase in the number of victims among children. 19% of civilian casualties were children, compared to with 10% in the previous months. All of them were boys aged between 9 and 15, injured when mines or unexploded ordnance detonated. More than half of all civilian casualties in August were the result of mines or unexploded ordnance. This underlines the failure of the sides to demine or, at the minimum, fence off or marked mines and unexploded ordnance. The sides promised they would do so in the Minsk Memorandum signed more than 3 years ago, and they again promised to do so in March 2016. More broken promises. The second lesson we can draw from our observations last week is that escalation is possible at any moment. Last week we actually saw localized escalation in the Svetlodarsk area. While the beginning of the week had been relatively calm around Svetlodarsk, the situation escalated on the evening of 23rd September. For some 5 hours, our monitors at the forward patrol base there heard engagements involving small arms fire and mortars, counting 37 mortar explosions in all. A similar situation was observed the following evening, and again weapons that should have been withdrawn were used. In all, the SMM recorded over 900 ceasefire violations in the Svetlodarsk area last week, over 90% of them at the weekend. We had not recorded such a high number of ceasefire violations in the Svetlodarsk area since early August. Dear friends, the violence around Svetlodarsk came suddenly, but not unexpectedly. We cannot predict where or when escalation will take place, but we know for sure it will happen, sooner or later. This certainty comes from experience. Where we have seen weapons present, they inevitably are used. And last week we saw weapons, loads of them. In terms of weapons in violation of respective withdrawal lines, our monitors observed such weapons 69 times last week, 14 times in government-controlled areas, and 55 times in areas not controlled by the government. Here, for instance, you can see 3 towed artillery pieces in so-called DPR-controlled Verkhnozhirovske, spotted by one of our unmanned aerial vehicles on 20th September. And this week, the observations continue. Here, in this photo, taken by a SMM unmanned aerial vehicle on 25th September, you can see 21 self-propelled artillery pieces and other equipment near government-controlled Oleksandropil. The 69 weapons spotted in violation of the withdrawal lines last week are but a small part of a much larger military hardware presence. Just beyond withdrawal lines, and a little more than a 15 minutes drive from striking distance of opposing lines, the SMM observed an additional 283 weapons, none of which were in designated storage sites. Take, for example, what one unmanned aerial vehicle saw in so-called LPR-controlled Mirne on 22nd of September. On that one day, we identified 30 tanks, 7 self-propelled howitzers, 6 towed howitzers, 9 mortars, and 6 anti-tank guns, as well as 56 infantry fighting vehicles, 6 trucks, each mounted with an anti-aircraft gun, 14 armored personnel carriers, 3 armored recovery vehicles, and 3 mine clearance vehicles. All of this hardware was well maintained, with many of them loaded with ammunition, signaling combat readiness. We have sent a number of unmanned aerial vehicles to this area. Here you can see what we saw. Remember, this battalion strength concentration of military hardware is a mere 5 kilometers from the respective withdrawal line and just 30 kilometers from the contact line. And remember also that this is not a permanent storage site. Weapons seen here are moved in and out at will. At another location controlled by the so-called LPR near Shimshivka, for example, satellite imagery revealed a large number of weapon systems, including 19 tanks, 17 armored personnel carriers, one of which was mounted with an anti-aircraft gun, a surface-to-air missile system, 3 self-propelled howitzers, 3 towed howitzers, and other vehicles in advance to combat formation. A few days later, only a fifth of those weapons were still there. Dear friends, it is almost impossible to say which specific weapon causes which specific explosion. The OSCE SMM deals with facts. We do not draw conclusions. I will therefore leave it up to you to draw your own conclusions as to the correlation between the weapons we saw last week, and indeed the ones we did not, and the continuing ceasefire violations. I'm also unable to conclusively prove that the site's refusal to disengage is a cause for the continued violation of the ceasefire. I can only report what we see. We see the greatest number of ceasefire violations where the sites are precariously close. Again, I leave it to you to draw conclusions. it is for you to decide if there is a correlation between ceasefire violations and the proximity of forces and hardware. The sides themselves certainly agree that there is such correlation. Otherwise, they would not have agreed to disengage at 3 pilot areas back in September 2016. Like with all their agreements, there has, however, been only partial compliance with the framework decision on the disengagement of forces and hardware. There has been little demining in any of the 3 disengagement areas, limiting the SMM's ability to verify the sites' compliance with their agreement to disengage. There has been no disengagement of forces or hardware in the Stanica Luhanska disengagement area. And last week, we actually recorded 54 ceasefire violations inside the Petriske disengagement area. Dear friends, since the sides recommitted to the ceasefire on the occasion of the new school year, the number of ceasefire violations has been considerably down on what has previously been. We all welcome that decrease, but the violence still continues. And the underlying causes sustaining it, namely the presence of weapons and the proximity of forces and hardware, remain in place. While we welcome the decrease in the number of ceasefire violations, we cannot ignore reality. Our monitors on the ground and our unmanned aerial vehicles in the air last week painted that reality quite well. Weaponry and armed men facing off against one another all along the contact line, with just a spark waiting to ignite a bushfire, one that next time may not be so easily contained. The sides must ensure that there is no next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hook. Now it's time for questions. And we have the first question in Ukrainian.
Crimean News Agency. Crimean News, could you please tell? Can you hear me, Mr. Hoog?
Apologize, my level of Ukrainian would not allow to follow your question, so you bear with me that little delay, but I think it should work now.
Okay, Crimean News, and the question is about the situation of security and safety of your office in Horlivka. It was reported that the security guards were withdrawn by DPR militants. Can you comment on the current situation, and did they give you the reason why they have withdrawn the security guards?
Thank you. Safety and security for our monitors is our first and most important priority. The security provided for our forward patrol bases depend on a security assessment the mission undertakes on a very regular basis. I can confirm that the armed men in non-government controlled Horlivka at our presence there had been withdrawn, but have been returned at 8 o'clock in the morning this Monday. I do not want to speculate on the reasons why these armed men had been withdrawn temporarily. Thank you.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, do you have more questions? No more question. Oh, one more.
Запитання. One more question, just a follow up or clarification. How many forward patrol bases are provided with safety and security in non-government controlled areas? Whether you witnessed any other cases where the militants withdrew the security guards in those bases, and do you follow up the events and developments in Kalinivka ammunition depot? You probably know about explosions at the depot.
Thank you. To your second question, I can confirm that we have a monitoring team in the vicinity of the site of that explosion, and the findings of that team will be made available in our reporting that you can find on our website in Ukrainian, English and Russian languages. And as to your follow-up question to security at our premises, we will always ask for those in control in the areas where we do have presences to ensure the safety and security of our staff. And should this not be the case, we always will follow up. And I've said it before, once again, safety and security is the main priority that directs and informs the work of our teams on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hook. If we have no more questions, thank you once again, and that would be all for today.